Hello and welcome. I'm Ali Emdad, Associate Dean of the Graves Business School at Morgan and the Director of the FinTech Center and the host of this webinar. We're grateful that Commissioner Peirce accepted our invitation to be with us in this virtual fireside chat for about an hour. After the introduction and the initial conversation, the Commissioner will participate in a Q&A session. Please use the Q&A feature to enter your questions, and also please identify yourself and your university or organization and your role. Hester and Peirce was appointed by President Donald J. Trump to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and was sworn in on January 11, 2018. Prior to joining the SEC, Commissioner Peirce conducted research on the regulations of financial markets at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She was a senior counsel on the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, where she advised ranking member Richard Shelby and other members of the committee on securities issues. Commissioner Peirce served as counsel to SEC Commissioner Paul S. Atkins. She also worked as a staff attorney in the SEC's Division of Investment Management. She was an associate at Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, now WilmerHead, and clerk for Judge Roger Anderwell on the Court of Federal Claims. Commissioner Peirce earned her bachelor's degree in economics from Case Western Reserve University and her JD from Yale Law School. She has been a persistent advocate for bringing clarity to the US crypto and blockchain arena. Many have applauded her safe harbor proposal, where crypto-related firms would be granted a 3-year grace period from the launch of their first token sale to reach a certain level of decentralization. Commissioner, we are indeed honored to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Ali.
Yeah.
It's such a delight to be here, and I'm really honored that we can do this and happy that we can do it virtually. I trust that everyone is staying healthy and safe, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I do want to start out with a little disclaimer, which is that the views that I represent are my own views and not necessarily those of the Securities and Exchange Commission or my fellow commissioners.
Very good. Let's start with a description of what SEC does. What are the primary goals of SEC, especially as it relates to crypto assets?
So the Securities and Exchange Commission is one of the capital markets regulators in the United States. We share that jurisdiction with the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and with our state regulators, which play an important role in regulating the securities markets as well. And so I'm one of typically 5 commissioners. Now we're down 1, so there are only 4 of us, and we are the ones who make the decisions at the agency, but we're supported by a staff of around 5,000 people spread across the United States in our regional offices. And we do everything with respect to regulating the securities markets, from regulating the investment advisors and the broker-dealers who help investors make decisions and engage in transactions, to regulating the exchanges on which securities trade, to regulating issuers, public companies, as they make offerings to the public. And so we have a really wide range of duties, and what has come to occupy much of our thinking now these days has been the crypto markets. And so what is the intersection between the securities laws and crypto? That's a matter of a fair amount of uncertainty these days. And we've provided some clarity, but there's still many questions. So one of the areas where our laws really have interacted in a pretty public way is the ICO craze. So a lot of token projects were doing initial coin offerings and have come to find out that the securities laws apply no matter how you're trying to raise money to fund a company. So if you're doing that through an initial coin offering, then our securities laws are going to apply, and you have to think about that. So there's been a fair amount of attention in that area. We've brought, starting in 2017, we've brought actions against projects that have done ICOs, and the theory is that if you're asking people to contribute money to build something in return for expecting an investment return, it really doesn't matter what you call it. That's going to be considered a securities offering. So that's one area where there's been interaction. And then people, if they're trading digital assets that are securities, have to think about how our rules applying to exchanges would apply to what they're doing. And then broker-dealers, investment advisors that want to be involved in this space also have to think about whether the securities laws govern how what they're doing and what those transactions are that they're advising on.
Okay, thank you. My next question is related to innovation and regulation. Is innovation in the U.S. crypto assets market helped or hampered by regulation? Not just SEC, but also CFTC and IRS and so on and so forth. Does it drive innovators away from the U.S., in other words?
Yeah, so that is one of the interesting issues that sort of, when I was thinking about coming to the SEC, one of the things that really worried me was that regulators and innovation often have a very fraught relationship, and regulators can stand in the way of innovation that would bring benefits to society. So what can we do to change the way that regulators approach innovation to make regulators more facilitators of innovation than, as you put it in your question, people that hamper innovation? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very difficult problem for regulators, because regulators tend to approach innovation with caution because they're worried. It's easier to say no to something because you never know what the lost opportunities are than to say yes to something and then have a problem occur down the road and have someone say to you, wait a minute, why did you let that innovation go forward? And you can see that across the spectrum of regulators. There are always going to be those balancing exercises that you have to engage in. Should we approve this drug? We don't know exactly how it's going to work. And same with our space. And what I had noticed from my prior time at the SEC is that we really tended to be, as an agency, in my mind, overly conservative in saying no, no, or at least in taking a really long time to say yes or no, which essentially means that people who have a great idea lose their first mover advantage, because it can be years before we act on something, and by that time someone else has come into the space. And also, we tend to want to make decisions for the market. So we come in and we want to say, well, we think this product isn't going to be attractive to investors. And from my perspective, it's better for us to look at, does this fit within, does it meet the legal requirements? And really, as a regulator, our mandate is quite limited. The core of our mandate is getting information to investors so that they can make their own decisions about whether to use a particular financial professional or whether to buy a particular financial product, a particular security. And so if we constrain ourselves to that mandate, then we can make sure the information gets out there, and the market can decide then whether it likes or doesn't like a particular innovation. And so I think those principles have really been put to the test in the crypto space, where you know, all of a sudden, all of these people are working on these projects, and they're people who are not used to dealing with the SEC. These are not the traditional financial firms coming in with a new financial product or service. These are people who are outside of our space, and they're coming in and they're saying, we want to do these things. And we're saying, whoa, you know, our securities laws might apply. And we're running into the reality that people on the outside really don't like to wait for years to get approval to do things. And so what we're seeing and what I'm hearing repeatedly is, Hester, we'd love to do our innovation in the United States. We'd love to offer these things to U.S. Consumers or to Americans. We'd like Americans to be involved in building these projects, but we can't do it. So what we're doing is we're not only doing this outside of the United States, but we're affirmatively putting up barriers so that Americans can't participate. And when I hear that, I get quite concerned. And so I think that having a regulatory framework that allows the flexibility for innovation to happen, while also ensuring that investors are protected, I think that's the ideal, and we need to do a better job of trying to get the balance right so that innovation can happen here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So my next question is a follow-up. It says China has to do with the number of patents that China issues, files the most blockchain patents in the world. Is the future of crypto in Asia, for instance, or in Europe or some of the other countries that are more friendly to some of the innovators in this space?
Well, I hope that the future of crypto is partly in the United States. I think it's great that there's innovation happening all over the world, but I certainly want it to happen here as well. I think the United States has a beautiful history of attracting the best and the brightest from all over the world to come here and work together and build things, and I want that to continue. I want to continue attracting both capital to the United States and innovators to the United States. Mm-hmm. So we do need to make some adjustments. I'd like us to try to think about ways to be more flexible, and I think other regulators are thinking along those lines too. You look at what the CFTC is doing. They are looking creatively at how they can work with innovators. I think we can learn from other countries that have tried different methods of working with innovators to help them navigate the regulatory framework and figure out where adjustments need to be made. Mm-hmm. And I think you see people across the financial regulators in the United States, in Congress, really intrigued by this new technology and trying to think about practical ways that we can adjust our regulation as needed. So I remain optimistic that we can keep some of that innovation here in the United States, but we do have work ahead of us to get there.
Mm-hmm. Very good. This next question deals with something that everybody is waiting to hear some news. Are we closer to seeing a digital dollar? Anytime.
Well, I'm happy to say that that's outside of my purview. That's the Fed's, certainly the Fed's decision. There's been a lot of talk about it, and I think ever since we saw China moving forward with this, with their plan, and a lot of other countries are talking about a central bank digital currency. So I think there's a lot of interest in that. We see the former CFTC chairman has launched a project on that. So I think we could see something in that vein, but again, that's outside of my purview, and and outside of my regulatory reach, so I can't tell you when that'll happen.
Okay. So let's focus on the safe harbor proposal. Are you satisfied with the rate at which regulation is done? How has the safe harbor proposal been received so far?
So let me provide a little background, because I think this is a little bit of a complicated area, and it's been one that's been a bit frustrating for people who have come from outside of a securities framework. And frankly, even securities lawyers have struggled with how to apply the securities laws in this area. So our securities laws in the United States are in some ways unusual, because they don't define security in a very precise way. What it does is our law says, look, as I mentioned before, if you're trying to raise money and you're doing so, it doesn't matter whether you call it a security. If what you're doing is raising money, and you're telling people, give me your money, rely on me to take that money and turn it into something more, you get a piece of what I create. That's a security. And so we have this kind of fluid definition, which a lot of people now have heard of the Howey test, which comes from a famous court case that helped define what the parameters of this an investment contract is. So an investment contract is one type of security. And so the Howey test was an old court case, but has been interpreted through the years to apply to lots of different things. And so now crypto comes along, and my view originally when I looked at this was, crypto's like anything else. You can just take Howey, you can apply it, and you can be done with it, and that's great. But as I've thought about this more and more, what I've seen is crypto is a little bit unusual, because when people sell tokens, those tokens are then intended to be used on the network. They're the currency of that realm of the network. And so while when you sell the token as part of an investment contract, that investment contract should be regulated as a security, you have to somehow allow the token itself to perform its function on the network without being treated as a security all the way, all through its life. And so I thought that we needed to have a safe harbor that allowed people to develop their networks, to allow the token to get into the hands of the people who would use that token on the network, to allow that network to decentralize, and to allow the token to take on functionality. And that's kind of the background behind the safe harbor. And so what I'm hoping to do, of course I would have loved it if my colleagues and I had all gotten together and put out that safe harbor proposal so that we could have a formal comment period going on. But what I decided to do is to put that proposal out there as my own proposal, to solicit input from people who are really much more knowledgeable in this space than I am, and to then think about, I'm hoping to put out a second version of it that will incorporate some of that feedback, and then get the ball rolling so that when my colleagues are ready to think about some sort of safe harbor mechanism, we'll have an idea that's ready to go. And so that's kind of what drove me to do this. It isn't typical for one commissioner to put out a proposal, but I thought this was a really important area for us to get discussion going. And so I've been really pleased that people have been willing to engage with me on this, willing to talk to me about what they think should be adjusted in the safe harbor, how it might work better, what the potential pitfalls might be, and really have gotten a pretty positive reception about the need for something like this. And if we had something like this, a lot of people have told me we would do our projects in the United States if we could rely on something like the safe harbor, which essentially gives people a 3-year period to get their networks up and running.
Very good. Um, the next question, wanted to bring up the issue of uh, analysts have been raising that there are some virtual asset trading platforms that have not implemented common standards for security, internal controls, market surveillance, protocols, disclosure, and other investor and consumer protections. Are these areas under SEC's jurisdiction? Do you believe that self-regulation works?
So I will answer your last question first. I do think self-regulation can be very effective, and you know, there are different ways of doing regulation. We've decided to perform some regulation at the government level, and that's why the SEC exists, and we can provide a really valuable role in the capital markets. But we have determined that some functions are appropriately handled by quasi-governmental regulatory organizations like FINRA, which is styled as a self-regulator, but has some authority that we grant it. And so we use the exchanges, for example. They serve in a self-regulatory capacity where they regulate their members and the activity on their markets. And that's been really effective for us to not concentrate all the power in the governmental regulator, but to spread it out a bit. So I think self-regulation can be effective. And I've heard those same concerns about a lot of digital asset trading platforms. I get people telling me, well, I've been ripped off by XYZ platform and I want you to do something about it. My response is, remember that unless those digital assets trading on that platform are securities, it's not in my realm. I can't, we don't regulate those platforms unless what they're trading is securities. So as an initial matter, I think a lot of the concerns that have arisen are really related to things, to trading platforms that are trading digital assets that are not securities. And so anyone using those platforms needs to be careful. And I like to say this all the time. If you are investing your money or purchasing something, if you're buying something, be careful. If you're using a platform that you are using for the first time, take the time to investigate that platform. Those are common sense ideas that apply whether or not it's a security that you're buying and selling or whether it's some other kind of asset you're buying and selling. You should be careful. You should ask questions when you have concerns. If you're not getting your questions answered, you might consider using some other platform. And so I think in the crypto world, there was an initial exuberance and willingness to kind of put money wherever, use whatever platform. And now people are, now that we've seen some of the problems, I think people are saying, wait a minute, I want to make sure that my platform has certain protections in place. And so people are asking more questions. And I think platforms are responding to those questions. And frankly, I think platforms can look to some of the ways that some of the things that are happening in the securities markets and can learn lessons from protections that were put in place on our platforms that are regulated by us. And so I think there's definitely a feedback there where they can learn from regulated platforms about some of the things that can help to make the platforms function better and be more secure. And so certainly there is a push now from the people who are using those platforms to make sure that they're taking steps that they need to take.
So a follow-up to that is, does SEC offer any help for people that want to inform and get information and be informed about the technical aspects of their investment, where they're going and what sort of things they should avoid? Is FinHub, for instance, one of those areas that people should visit?
Well, so FinHub is for people who have an idea that they maybe want to, they're constructing a crypto project and they're wondering what the interaction with the securities laws are. They can come to FinHub and they can either ask for relief from the securities laws or just try to understand how the securities laws might interact with what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Now, investor.gov is a really useful place for people to go who are investors and who have questions about how the securities markets operate and maybe some of the areas that they should be on the alert, some of the problems they should be on the alert and on the lookout for. I really commend that site for people. There's some really good information about all different kinds of investment opportunities. And when we see problems happening, often the folks in our investor education office will put something on investor.gov to warn people, hey, this is something you should watch out for. I mean, I'd like to dwell a bit on that now because I think a lot of people are, they're getting the stimulus checks and there might be people who are trying to prey on folks who get those checks. Be very careful, ask lots of questions before you invest your money. And there are also people who are looking at this COVID-19 and they're saying, oh, well, this is great. We can take advantage of this by creating a scam, you know, saying, for example, we've got the cure, or saying that you've developed a vaccine. Or so be on the lookout when companies claim that they have an answer, when they've got a cure. Ask lots of questions before you invest your money. There are people who are willing to take advantage of a really bad situation and hurt people, so please be careful.
Okay, thank you. New York has implemented bid license regulation that is one of the first in the country and is a very strong one. It imposes licensing requirements on crypto asset exchanges and wallets. Do you believe that states should develop their own regulation? Do states coordinate with the SEC?
We do have a pretty complicated regulatory framework in the U.S. where we have both state regulators and federal regulators in the securities space, and more generally in the financial regulatory framework. So there are state bank regulators. States regulate money transmission, which is how a lot of the regulation at the state level is happening in the crypto space. And so states have taken different approaches. New York was out there early with their BIT license. Wyoming has been very active. And so one benefit of that framework is that states can distinguish themselves by doing regulation well and by therefore attracting innovators to that space. By contrast, if they don't get the balance right, people will avoid those states. And so we can quickly see what's working and what's not. We do coordinate with our state securities regulators. We coordinate closely. We rely on their closer to what's happening on the ground. They spot problems quite early, and we work with them to prevent bad things from happening in our securities markets, and also work with them to try to think about ways that we can better facilitate capital formation. So the state regulators are really good partners for us. I think one of the frustrations, though, has been that it's really difficult for innovators in this space to think about dealing with so many different state regulators. And then on the federal level, as I mentioned at the beginning, we share regulatory oversight of the capital markets with the CFTC, but there are also a whole host of banking regulators. And so in the crypto space, it can be quite difficult to know who's responsible for regulating. And so it can be pretty intimidating for a small project to try to think about the legal bills that it might have to think about in order to navigate that really complex regulatory forest. And so one suggestion has been that we think about, at least at the federal level, of creating a sandbox that runs across different regulators, and that would allow innovators to come into that regulatory sandbox and work with multiple regulators. I think that's an interesting idea. I'd like to explore that further. There already is really good coordination on the digital asset topic specifically across federal regulators, and even with our international counterparts, because obviously a lot of this stuff crosses, all of it crosses international borders too, and so we're working with our counterparts through international organizations to try to deal with some of these challenges too. But it can be really difficult because you do have jurisdictions that overlap or certainly interact with one another.
Very good. Commissioner, at this point, I would like to bring in Dr. Bhatna to, excuse me, to start the Q&A session, if you don't mind. There are some questions
Wonderful.
already submitted, and just as a reminder, please, I'm requesting that all attendees to mention where they're from, what organization, and their role as well. Identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. This was a very, very informative talk. We have so far 2 questions. The first is from Casey Riddle. She's a junior from Savannah State University. And the question is, how do small startup hedge funds, do they have to register with SEC?
Casey, thank you for your question. And the registration for hedge fund advisors is something that has changed over time. So it used to be that hedge fund advisors did not have to register, but now advisors do have to register if they are advising funds that are of a certain size. And so you should consult if you're planning to start a hedge fund. I certainly suggest that you consult a lawyer and figure out what your registration obligations are, and make sure that you have that all in line, because that is a place where a lot of people do end up running into problems if they haven't really thought about that before they start their hedge fund. So please, as an advisor, do consult a lawyer. Post Dodd-Frank, which obviously followed our last crisis, the rules for registration of hedge fund advisors changed.
Thank you. The next question is from Pamela Queen from Morgan State University. And this deals with the announcement by US Treasury Secretary in February that there will be significant new requirements on cryptocurrencies, which will be forthcoming. So is it realistic that given the COVID situation, given the presidential pending elections, would we see anything significant this year, or will it be next year? If so, what is it that we can expect on that aspect?
Pamela, thank you for the question. I think that one thing to bear in mind is that even though there's a lot of work that is concentrated on the health situation and the economic fallout from that, there are a lot of folks who are continuing on doing their regular jobs, and so I know I can't speak for Treasury, but I know at the SEC we have a big workforce, and we are continuing on with our regular work, although we're doing it mostly from home. We are continuing on with our day-to-day work. So, for example, rulemakings will move forward, enforcement actions will move forward, and so I suspect that is the same across other government regulators. That said, I can't speak specifically to what Treasury will do, as that's outside my purview. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but you know, typically the way regulations are written, and this is something that a lawyer might know, but someone who's not a lawyer might not know how this works. Typically, the rule will go out as a proposal, and then there'll be a time for the public to comment on those rules, and then the adoption will be put out, which takes into account those comments. And so you'll typically get a preview of what the final rulemaking is, but what that also means is that it does extend out the time period that it takes to actually do something. So if it's going to be done as a formal rule, it can take quite a long time.
Thank you. The next question is from Felix Ayadi from Texas Southern University. And the question is, deals with the trading platforms. The question is, do you think that the existence of the alternative trading platforms would have an adverse effect on the traditional exchanges in terms of market depth?
Felix, that is an interesting question that has occupied the minds of securities professionals and securities lawyers in the traditional securities space. So we have seen that in the traditional securities space, there are these alternative trading systems, ATSs they're called, and those are trading pools that are not registered as exchanges. And there has indeed been a lot of volume that's moved from the traditional exchanges over to those ATSs, and that has concerned some people. Others think it's a healthy function, a healthy manifestation of just different preferences by different traders at different times. And so, you know, the exchange works better for some types of transactions, whereas ATSs might be a better fit for other types of transactions. And so what we're trying to do at the SEC in terms of traditional securities regulation is make sure that the regulation is appropriate on exchanges and on ATSs. We've made some changes in the way, in the types of things that ATSs have to report to us, and the type, the way they're regulated. So we're thinking about these kinds of things, certainly in the traditional securities space, and welcome people's thoughts on that, because one of the things that we really do want to make sure exists, the exchanges offer a very transparent price formation mechanism, and one that can benefit the whole market. So we want to balance that with the need for people to be able to trade in ways that that reflect all of their needs and their concerns.
Thank you, Commissioner. The next question is from an MBA student at Morgan State University, Jiang Yin Yu. The question is, do you think the digital currency makes our transactions safer or more dangerous?
Jiang, that's a very open-ended question there. Look, I think there has been some concern around digital currencies simply because of some of the early uses of digital currencies in illicit transactions. But what I always like to remind people is that cash is still used in lots of illicit transactions because it is the most anonymous in a real sense. And so a lot of people use cash in illicit transactions. That doesn't mean that you outlaw cash. It means that you deal with the illicit transactions as a separate problem. But digital currencies really can be a very useful way for people to transact with one another in a way that eliminates some of the friction that might exist, for example, of having to deal with one currency in one country and another currency in another country. If you enable people a way to transact with one another in a currency that both of them can then take and convert into their own currency, that can be quite efficient. And so let's think about allowing people to transact in the way they want, but making sure that we're putting in the necessary protections, which is why you've seen the emphasis, for example, on anti-money laundering and know your customer rules with respect to digital currencies. And certainly you can address the illegal behavior no matter what the nature of the currency is that's being used for that transaction.
Thank you. The next question is from Alexander Dubos, a first-year law student at Harvard University School of Law. And this question deals with the relationship between SEC and FINRA. The question is, how does SEC work with FINRA to ensure that financial professionals are qualified to speak to their clients about cryptocurrency offerings and alternative investments?
Alexander, I'm glad to hear from a law student. I'm going to put in a plug right now for folks who are law students and who are interested in being interns at the SEC. We have a very active intern program, and so if you're interested in that, you should inquire. Check out the information on our website or feel free to contact my office. We always take an intern, so if you do get into the intern program and you're interested in working in my office, we'd love to hear from you. But that said, the question is about the SEC's relationship with FINRA, and as I mentioned before, FINRA is it's a self-regulatory organization, or I like to call it a quasi-governmental regulatory organization because it's separate from the SEC. It is a membership organization, so if you're a broker-dealer, you become a member of FINRA, and then FINRA regulates its own members. And so they play an important role, sort of the frontline regulator of broker-dealers. And so in that capacity, they are applying the standard rules that apply to those brokers as they transact in any kind of securities. They'll apply those same rules to broker-dealers that are engaged in digital securities transactions. And so, you know, if you're dealing with your client and you're making recommendations that are not in the best interest of that client, it doesn't matter what kind of security it is digital or traditional, you'll be held to that same standard, which is you know, requires you to do your homework and know what it is that you're recommending and think about the circumstances that your client is in before you make those recommendations. So I think we really should think about it in the same way that we think about their interactions with clients with respect to traditional securities. Now, it is true, I think what your question is getting at is that you know, clients, customers are increasingly interested in trying to get access to digital assets. And I think that we'll see more and more that financial professionals dealing with those people are going to have to figure out whether they have the expertise necessary to provide advice, and they may have to go ahead and themselves get more educated so that they can then make good, solid recommendations about whether and how their customers should get access to those securities or to those assets.
Thank you. While we are waiting for more questions to come in, I would like to ask you a question, and that is, you mentioned about the sandbox. Considering all these plethora of regulations, states, international borders, etc., can you give us some sense of the progress on this sandbox?
Sure. So the sandbox idea is not tied specifically to digital assets or blockchain, but rather there has been this idea, I think going back to some of the concerns that I outlined, early on in this conversation about regulators and their interaction with innovation. And there's, you know, we're not alone in having securities laws that are pretty well established and pretty old. And so when you have rules that were written a long time ago, they might not work for new technologies. And so that was sort of the theory behind the sandbox approach. Tell us what you want to do, come into the regulator, tell us what you want to do, we'll work with you to allow you to try that, but to do it under the watchful eye of the regulator, to make sure that investors or consumers aren't getting hurt. And I think this has been a pretty effective approach. Now, one concern that I have about that approach is that I think innovation, when it's done under the very close scrutiny of a regulator, maybe moves in a different direction than it would if you just took the entrepreneurs and allowed them to do their thing in their garage without a regulator sitting looking over their shoulder. So I do think we have to be careful not to try to micromanage the entrepreneurial process. So that's kind of the tension that I feel. Some people have argued that the safe harbor that I've proposed is somewhat of a sandbox because it really does allow this development to happen in this 3-year period without the micromanagement of us or any other regulator. And the idea is, look, we want to make sure that when people are buying these tokens, they're getting the information they need about the project, about the network for which they're buying a token. We want to make sure that they know who's on the development team, how are these tokens going to be mined, how many does the development team retain for itself, what's the code? Put the code out there so that people can actually see the code. They can see whether, you know, your white paper might be wonderful, but if your code doesn't match your white paper, then there's a problem. So let people actually have that information they need. I think one of the core goals of the securities laws is to get people who are buying securities the information they need. It addresses this information asymmetry problem. If I start a company, I know exactly what the company is doing, where the money is going, how it's being spent. If you are potentially thinking of becoming a shareholder in that company, you want to understand what's going to happen to your money when you invest the money. And that's a really important role for us as a securities regulator to play. And so when folks at the SEC see these ICOs happening, they really worry about this information asymmetry problem. And I think that's a valid worry. So what the safe harbor does is it says, let's get information that really is important in this space, which is a bit different than it is for traditional securities. Let's get that information out there and allow people to then make an informed decision about whether they want to buy these tokens.
Thank you. While we are waiting for one more question, I have one more question, and this relates to Reg D and Reg CF. Are you seeing any increased aspects with respect to these regulations in the cryptocurrency side?
Yeah, I think that cryptocurrency projects have been thinking about different approaches that they can take to raise money in a way that's consistent with our regulatory framework. And so one approach that has worked for some projects is they've used Regulation A, which is sort of like a mini IPO. And that has been one way that some projects have been able to do their offerings. I think it still does raise the question of what happens to that token. How can you ensure that the token gets into the hands of people that want to use it? How can you ensure that it becomes functional in a way that's still consistent with the securities laws? So I think it does still open issues, raise issues. Now I think that some Reg D, for example, allows you to do an offering in a way that limits your pool of investors. And that can be quite useful. I think a lot of people have realized that one way to build a crypto network is to start by making an offering only to accredited investors. We have a framework that allows accredited investors, people who have higher wealth and income by and large, to buy certain securities that other people can't buy. So if you do your initial, you raise your initial funds from accredited investors, that may be one way to get the project off the ground, and maybe a way to ensure that you're staying compliant with the securities laws. Other people have thought about reg crowdfunding in the crypto space. You know, reg crowdfunding was designed really in response to this idea that a lot of people were doing sort of donation-based fundraising. So, you know, if you could put your project up and say, here's what I'm trying to build. If you'd like to be part of this, you know, maybe I'll give you a mug, or I'll give you a free something in exchange for your donation. But the idea was, hey, why not let people who actually want to participate get a piece of the action? And so that's where kind of reg crowdfunding came from. You can actually provide the money, but then you'll have a share of the company that you provided the money to, or you could do it as debt crowdfunding as well. And so that idea, I think, is a really powerful idea, and one that has particular power now at a time when so many small businesses are struggling in light of what's going on in the economy now. I think crowdfunding could be a powerful tool. We have put some restrictions around it that make it pretty hard and expensive to use, and I'm hoping that we can address some of those concerns, and maybe at least temporarily loosen some of those restrictions so that it can be more useful, just generally during this crisis.
Thank you, Commissioner. Dr. Emdad.
Yeah, let me ask another question here, and that has to do with the future. What direction do you think we're going, and should we expect some drastic innovations in the near term, in terms of blockchain, in terms of different innovations are coming in this space, and are you hopeful?
I am hopeful. I think it's a really exciting time, and I think that it's exciting because there's a lot of interest in digital assets, in cryptocurrency, in blockchain, in artificial intelligence, and I think those are changing the way that we are doing and will do a lot of different things. Having basically a currency of the internet is a really powerful concept that allows us to think about involving people in projects, people from all over the world, bringing them together to work on something together in ways that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And especially now, we're seeing people all over the world being confined to their homes. The idea that the irony that on the one hand you're confined to your homes, you can't travel, but on the other you can work together with people across the world to build something through blockchain and through crypto is really powerful and exciting. I think we're also seeing in the traditional security space, for example, we're seeing traditional financial firms saying, how can we use blockchain to make more efficient things that we were doing? I think some of that will take some time, but there's definitely research and interest going on thinking about those things. And then on the artificial intelligence side, I mean, that's changing the way we're doing lots of different things. And so we see things like a lot of robo-advisors don't like that name, but we're seeing the automation of investment advice, for example, or of managing your money. And that's making investment advice available to people who wouldn't have been able to afford that kind of advice before. And so there's real power in sort of democratizing access to the financial system. And I think that's really exciting. It's hard for me as a lawyer to predict the direction that some of these things will go, but I certainly think it's exciting to think about ways that we can use technology to broaden access to the financial markets, to make the financial markets work more efficiently, and to bring people together from across the country and across the world, and maybe to bring capital into parts of the country that have not had access to capital before. I think that's one thing that, as a securities regulator, is really frustrating to me, to see that, you've got the coastal cities and you've got a lot of venture capital activity and a lot of other capital flowing around in those coastal cities, but it's much harder to get that capital into the middle of the country. And so I think technology will help to bridge that gap. And I actually think that, as awful as the situation is that's going on right now, people's realization that they can actually accomplish a lot in a sort of format like the one that we're engaged in right now will mean that you can bring people together. You can bring people into your community who have money, even if they're not traveling to your community. So I think there is hope, and there is room for optimism.
Mm-hmm. Great. But there are no more questions at this point. I think we should end it with that hopeful and inspiring comment that you made about the future directions that we're going. I wanted, again, I really, I'm honored to have you here at this webinar. We are all grateful for giving us this time to answer some questions and shed some light on some of these important questions that are on our minds. This is difficult times for everyone, and we are again lucky that we were able to have you here. Initially, we had the intention of having our event actually tomorrow, and you kindly accepted our invitation to be here in Baltimore. However, because of the circumstance that we're in right now, we had to move online. And now the online life that we live, we want to enrich it with speakers like you, and the experience that you share with us is extremely important. With that, I want to thank Dr. Bapna, Sanjay Bapna, and the team at Morgan for helping in organizing this webinar and the other 3 webinars that we had early on in April. We hope to see you in person sometime soon. I know that the students would love to hear you in person, and we definitely will invite you again to join us.
That would be wonderful, and thank you for putting this together. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to all the people in the audience. And I just would invite people, if they have thoughts on the safe harbor or anything else the SEC is doing, don't hesitate to reach out directly to my office. We'd love to hear from you. And while we may not be able to meet in person, we're certainly open for business in terms of doing calls, and so would love to hear from you.
Thank you. Be safe. Stay healthy. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.